Hello, Alex here, and today we're going to talk about color filters and what they do for your black and white photography. Let's get right into it. So let's start off by talking about what colored filters actually are. They are simply a piece of glass of a very specific tint and intensity of color that attaches to your lens. You could have a screw-on filter, which is the most common type. They come in a square format for use with like a leaf filter adapter that would screw on the front of your lens. So you could stack that with multiple filters more easily, or use it with extreme wide angle lenses with, those like really bulbous front elements. And you can also buy them as gelatin filters, so not actually made of glass at all, that can go into the rear of some lenses that don't take filters on the front, such as those with extreme bulbous front elements. They can be broadly classified into two types: color correction and overall color filters. So color correction filters, which are not what we're talking about here today, are much more mild. Their color shift is much less intense, and you would use these for color correction, usually for white balance with film. So you would use something like an 85B color filter to shoot tungsten balanced film in daytime without that strong blue greenish kind of cast. Then color filters, I don't know if there's a more technical name, but I can't seem to find one. The general type that we're talking about here today are much stronger, like a strong red, green, whatever, we'll get into that. And they are used to modify your image in a more drastic way. And they usually aren't used with color film because they usually look crap, because the color cast is so extreme. So being colored glass, a color filter will reduce the transmission of certain colors of light through itself and into your lens, whereas other colors will pass more easily. The colors that pass easily through the lens are those the same as or similar to the color of the filter. For example, orange filters allow yellow and red light to pass through relatively easily. And the colors that are filtered out the most are the complementary colors on the color wheel, which we'll get into. I'll show you that with some pictures that I've made up. As I mentioned, these would cause an extreme color cast when used with color film or a color digital camera, so you don't really use them. But with black and white film, what they do is they change the brightnesses of certain colors within your frame, which can be used to adjust the contrast and the overall depth of your scene, depending on what colors are present and what kind of a look you're going for. The most common colors available are red, green, yellow, blue, and orange. Though there are all sorts of in-between and more extreme variants like deep red, blue-green, or dark orange. The set that I purchased from eBay includes red, green, blue, and yellow filters, and those are realistically the most common types that most people would need. If you're purchasing a starter set, don't go for a yellow, orange, red set. Make sure you get at least a green filter and maybe a blue filter if you like the look that you get. You'll see later on here. That just gives you the maximum versatility, so you would be better doing that unless you know exactly what you're going for, which, maybe this video will actually help you figure that out. So I mentioned the way that the filters allow a certain color of light through while blocking the complementary color. So if you take, in theory, a filter that blocks blue light, that in your black and white image will give you a darker sky because there is less actual blue light coming through and hitting your film or your sensor if you're shooting a digital camera in black and white mode, or which is not advisable, or a dedicated black and white monochrome sensor camera. Because the filters work by actually blocking light that would otherwise enter the lens, you do have to compensate with a longer shutter speed, a higher ISO, or a wider aperture, because you are restricting the amount of light that comes into your lens, and that has to be compensated for or you won't get a good exposure. If you're using an external meter, do make sure you consider this. Where if you're using a TTL meter, your camera should be pretty good at picking this up. But there are general rules of thumb for these various types of filter, and you could just go with those general rules of thumb depending on what color it is. For example, my red filter has a general filter factor, as it's called, of 3 stops. So 8 times as much light is required when shooting with that filter as compared to not using any filter at all. Whereas my yellow filter and my green filter have filter factor of between 1 and 1.5 stops. So now I'm going to take your attention over here for a second. if we bring up a color wheel, and now if we color in the center to show you what color filter we're talking about, and that's what I'm going to use to denote the filter color as we go through this. So now we have a green filter here, and the color wheel is around it. Theoretically, we would expect to see these shades of green brightened as they pass more easily through a green filter, and then these shades of violet and magenta would not pass through the filter as easily. So subjects with those colors, or that are partially containing those colors, because you'll see some subjects are kind of mixed color in reality, they would become darker in your final black and white image. In reality though, these filters are not what we would call monochromatic, meaning they let more than a single wavelength through. If they were monochromatic, your filter factor would be something stupid like 40 stops. You know, it would be absolutely ridiculous and you wouldn't be able to use them. Monochromatic filters are what you use for like actual dedicated laser science, where your laser has a hopefully very narrow spectrum of light emission, where you only have one or very narrow range of wavelengths being emitted, but that's not how these filters work. So in reality, instead of a line like we had, you see something more like this, where you have sort of ranges of color that are brightened and ranges of color that are darkened. And this is nice in that they're completely opposite to each other. So you can just kind of rotate these around the color wheel anywhere you want to see how it works for the other filters, such as the red filter, yellow filter, and blue filter. You could just take a similar look at this from any point on the color wheel if you want to look at a given filter. Say an orange filter, you could just go to the orange point of the color wheel and then go to the opposite and see what colors will be brightened and darkened based on that. So look, I can talk about how color filters work all day long, but the best thing to do is actually show you. So here we have a scene that I took pictures of recently. I took pictures without a filter, then in order with the yellow, red, green, and blue filters. So we'll have a look at them. Here it is in color. You can see we have a wide range of blues, yellows, greens, and reds throughout the image, especially some of the more complex subjects like this bush in the front and the actual cladding on the front of the building. They're kind of mixed tonality with a bit of blue and red, so we see some nice color shifts, well, brightness shifts, tonal shifts in the final black and white images. I took this color picture on my phone, by the way, so ignore the quality. One unfortunate thing to note is that the clouds came in while I was taking these pictures after I took this one on my phone, and I waited like 35 minutes for them to actually break in the end, and I only got a little bit of open blue sky in the end, so I was kind of disappointed in that, but we can still see a little bit of change in the sky, just not as drastic as I wanted to show you, but them's the breaks. Right, so let's go and actually look at the side-by-side comparisons. Okay, so here and in all of these comparisons, we have the unfiltered black and white image on the left-hand side. I compensated for the filter factor with each of these images during the shooting process, and then I edited them very slightly just to kind of fine-tune any difference in exposure, because I was using my handheld meter through the filters, and I can't guarantee that I did that, perfectly. So there are some differences you can see here with the yellow filter, and this shows, in my opinion, exactly why a yellow filter is considered the default contrast boosting day-to-day black and white filter that most people should have. And I completely agree with that notion. The overall contrast is boosted nicely. There's more contrast in the foliage. You look at the grass and there's actually more contrast there despite being mostly green. The sky is slightly darker, which adds, again, a small amount of contrast, not as much as I would have liked if the clouds stayed away, but, some. Then that big tree in the left, there's a bit more contrast there because the yellow is separating out some of the blue-green, like the lighter teal tones that would come through, because again, colors aren't monochromatic, they're not monodisperse. And that smaller bush in front of that tree darkens quite a lot because this is a yellow filter, and I said that bush had some mixed red and blue colors, and this filter will darken blues as we see in the sky. So that front bush actually darkens slightly, and that provides a lot more separation between that bush and the tree behind it than you get in the unfiltered image. Overall, I think the yellow filter is absolutely amazing, and it's probably my second favorite of this batch of 4 images, not counting the unfiltered one. Next, we have the image taken with the red filter. So with a red filter, we get brighter yellows, reds, oranges, and pinks, more or less, and darker greens, teals, blues, and maybe purples. So this is much more different to the original image. The sky is dark. Now the clouds were in here, so you can't really see a huge difference, but they are much darker than the original image. All of the foliage has darkened because it's those light green tones that were starting to be filtered out with the yellow filter that are being filtered much more strongly here in the case of the red filter. This has the side effect of reducing the difference between that bush and tree on the left-hand side, just because you're filtering the green out of the tree and the blue out of the bush, so it has that sort of negative effect between them. But you notice those tulips in the foreground are a lot brighter and more punchy here because they have lots of yellow and red, so they get much brighter in this kind of scene. So if you're shooting foliage in general, a red filter might not be a good idea, but if you're shooting, rich colored flowers where you have your yellows, reds, oranges, pinks, that could help to enhance the separation of tonality between your leaves, your stems, any kind of foliage in the background or foreground versus the actual flowers, if that's what you want to go for. That's one of the uses of a red filter. Next, we have a green filter, and I think this is probably my favorite of these images. And I mean, a green filter is kind of the de facto for landscape foliage type stuff if you don't want to go the yellow filter, red filter route of darkening the sky. Here it was cloudy, so just by happenstance, it works out that a green filter is quite nice here. The cladding on the building is darkened quite a lot because it had a lot of red and blue in it, but like dark blue. The foliage itself isn't as bright as you would have expected when using a green filter. You should see a lot brighter greens there, but I think that's probably either down to me metering the scene poorly, because I did not meter for the foliage, or it could just be that I did something wrong during the scanning and editing process. But we do see that the green filter, by filtering out some of the red tones, gives a little bit of separation between the tree and the bush on the left-hand side. Nothing crazy. That taller, narrower bush in front of the window is also green, but it's a very dark green, and for whatever reason, that is filtered much more strongly. So it's possible that the overall image is just underexposed, and that should be the same color, and everything else would be a lot brighter. But regardless of how I exposed it, I mean, I could change that quite easily. You see the overall effect there. It adds a bit of contrast in the foliage, nothing too crazy, but it's nice. Lastly, we have the blue filter. Blue filters are very rarely used because they don't make people or most subjects in general look very nice. I'm not going to get too technical here, but a blue filter gives a kind of a low contrast, hazy, foggy look, and that's exactly what we see here because it's subject to and enhances the effects of what's called Rayleigh scattering, which, if you don't know about it, I'm not going to go all physics on you. It's what makes the sky blue. The sky itself is physically not blue, but this physical effect causes it to appear blue, if that makes any sense. So it would be useful to use a blue filter on a hazy, foggy, misty day, perhaps, if you wanted to enhance that effect. I would personally use something like a diffusion filter instead, like a Tiffin or Cinebloom filter. It's a very flat and washed out image, and it doesn't look that great. So lastly, I want to talk about the kind of general applications of these filters and what you would use each of them for in a typical scenario. Obviously, you can do whatever you want. You can get a look for a given scene, and most of these apply more to portraiture and landscape kind of stuff. For urban photography, you do what you want, see how it works out for your scene, especially if you're shooting digitally, you can do whatever you want. A yellow filter is your general day-to-day, boost the contrast a little bit without affecting things too much kind of filter. It cuts a little bit of haze out of the air, which may or may not be relevant depending on your shot, and it adds that nice small punch of contrast that we saw. Orange is more of the same, but more towards red. A red filter will enhance the brightness of skin, and that may or may not be attractive depending on what you want to shoot. As we saw, it also darkens greens, so if you're doing like flower photography, it could possibly be useful if the flowers are what you want to focus on and not the surrounding foliage. A green filter is a sort of portraiture filter or landscape filter. For portraiture, it will darken the skin in most cases. Like, our skin does give off a lot of red light, regardless of the color of your skin. Like, in terms of RGB, it is mostly red. And the green filter will cut that out. So you see a lot more texture in skin. So it can be used to enhance things like freckles, or if you have any kind of imperfection that you're trying to show off or not hide, then that's very useful. Whereas the red filter, I didn't mention that, will hide those imperfections by kind of smoothing out the tones in the skin. It enhances the red light coming off your skin. And then lastly, the blue filter, as I mentioned, has very limited use, but it has a place. I personally don't like the effect. Maybe you do, but then again, I haven't shot it on a misty day yet, so it could look quite good there. I'd like to thank you for joining me and sticking to the end of this video where we talked about the effects of color filters on black and white photography. Hopefully you found this information useful and maybe even entertaining. I would appreciate any help and support that you can give this channel, whether that's by subscribing or by donating to my Patreon, where the tiers start at just €1 per month. If you don't already, consider following me on Instagram, where I post new photos every single day. Thank you, have a nice day, and stay safe.